David, thank you for talking with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this book?
You know, in 2004, I wrote a book called Church Planting Movements that analyzed 25 movements of multiplying churches that were breaking out among people groups all over the world. It was exciting to me. Even then, we had our first one or two Muslim movements to Christ that I wrote about. In the years since then, as I've worked among Muslims and others in South Asia and in the Middle East, we often talk about, have you heard about this movement in this place? And increasingly we're hearing about Muslim movements to Christ. Then I began to hear from people saying, why don't you do a book on not just church planting movements, but church planting movements among Muslims? This intrigued me. Then a foundation stepped forward, and working with Southern Baptists and the Sky Foundation, they said, look, if you'll do it, we will underwrite it. And as a result, by the grace of God and these two gracious organizations, I've been able to spend the last 2 years traveling really anywhere I needed to go. And I've traveled about 250,000 miles in the last 2 years, interviewing in these movements, going into places I'd never been before, collecting interviews I never dreamed possible to get. And now I have over 1,000 stories of Muslims from movements who are talking about the ways that God is at work and the way that He drew them to realize their lostness and their need for Jesus Christ. It's been a wonderful, wonderful adventure.
Define for me then, what do you mean when you say movement?
You know, movements have been defined in various ways. Movements have internal momentum as opposed to something being imposed from the outside. They reach multiple generations, so one reaches another, reaches another. For purposes of clarity and for purposes of talking apples and apples and oranges, I've just set an arbitrary bar. I've said in this case what I'm talking about is a movement of people over a period of 1 to 2 decades where we've seen at least 1,000 baptisms or at least 100 churches planted in that period of time. Now the reason for putting those parameters are so that if something phenomenal happens and a lot of Muslims say yes to Jesus, but they never get to baptism or they never form churches, well, you know, that's wonderful that that happened, but that's not what I'm talking about. So that whether I'm talking from the first century of the Muslim period or the current times today, you'll know that I'm talking about the same thing. We're comparing apples to apples. Baptisms, at least 1,000 within a given people group or community. So we're not just stretching them all across the Muslim world. This is among one people group with a common language and ethnic identity. We're seeing at least 1,000 baptisms or at least 100 churches planted. And in some cases, we're talking tens of thousands. So 1,000 is sort of a threshold, a floor, if you will. The ceiling, we can't even begin at this time to know how high that ceiling is.
So what makes this movement unprecedented?
Well, the most unprecedented thing is if you've got 1,400 years of Christianity and Islam rubbing up against each other, and for 1,300 years you had no single movement of even 1,000 Muslims coming to faith in Christ. And yet during that same time frame, you've had tens of millions of Christians assimilated into the Muslim world. Tens of millions of Christians assimilated. For the first time in 1,400 years, we're now seeing the tide flow back the other way.
And when you say assimilated, you mean Christians who've converted to Islam?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, whether it's forced conversion, whether it's incentives, a lot of duplicity, a lot of coercion, nonetheless, not a lot of reversals. Islam is like a highway with all on-ramps. You come on, but you don't exit. There's no exit.
In part 1 of the book, you talk about the 9 rooms in the House of Islam. Can you flesh that out a little bit for me?
Well, as we looked across the Muslim world, we recognize that Islam is not a monolith. The Muslim world is not monolithic. It's not homogeneous. It's very different from West Africa, West African Islam. The experience, the history, the culture, the language, the geography, everything is very different there than, say, in Central Asia. In Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, or in Indonesia. So what we try to do is look and see how does this world define itself. And there did appear to be 9 distinct cultural zones or affinity blocks, like West Africa is a room, if you will, in the House of Islam. House of Islam is what Muslims used to refer to their world. There's 2 worlds from their vantage point, the House of Islam and the house of war. The house of war is that part of the world that's not yet Muslim. So as you look across the house of Islam, there are 9 rooms: West Africa, North Africa, the Arab world, Eastern Africa, each a distinct room. Now they interact to some extent, but they also have their own history, their own language families and culture and dynamics. The Persian world, Turkestan, that long continuum of Turkic peoples from Turkey to Western China. Western South Asia, which includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the western parts of India. Then Eastern South Asia, which is those parts of India that spill over into Bangladesh, include the Bengali people. And then finally, Indo-Malaysia, that Malay peninsula going across into the Indonesian archipelago. Altogether, these make up 9 separate rooms that comprise the House of Islam.
When we watch the news today, we often hear the word Muslim associated with radical fundamentalism, and that is also usually associated with the Arab world. But isn't it true that most Muslims are not actually Arabs at all? Who are Muslims?
Well, it's the diversity of Muslims that we have to keep in mind. You know, 1.6 billion people, they're rapidly approaching. They will be, in the next few years, as much as a quarter of the world's population. Now within that you have mothers and fathers, you have wonderful husbands and wives with children that they love and want to see a beautiful future for. You have people who are secular, you have people who are practical atheists living within the Islamic culture. And then you have radical fanatical believers. Now, Islam does have the distinctive that it was born in a context of war. And jihad is woven into some of the fundamentals of Islam, so that when one wants to turn to that, or if one wants to use that to his advantage, they have for 1400 years used jihad as a tool that they can use to exert their will. Of course, there's been many times in Christian history when our political leaders, whether it was in Catholic Europe or in Protestant America, have used religion as a justification for violence. But you're hard-pressed to go back to Jesus and find a sanction for that. If you go back to Muhammad, you don't have any difficulty. I've met terrorists who have become wonderful, radiant, born-again followers of Jesus Christ. And the transformation in their heart really goes down to the very core of who they are. They become forgiven, and they become love-based rather than anger and resentment and law-based. When that happens, they become a person who's willing to lay down their life for others rather than lay down their life to take other lives.
We've been talking with you so far about part 1 of your book, and we're going to be talking to you a little later about part 2. But can you give us a little bit of a hint of what part 2 is going to be about?
Part 2?
Yeah.
Part 2 will have 9 chapters. Each chapter is a room in the House of Islam, West Africa, North Africa, and so forth, all the way across the Muslim world. And we will dive into those rooms. We'll analyze the context so that we understand the stories that come out of those rooms. And then we'll listen. We'll let people tell us, what did God use to bring you to saving faith in Jesus Christ? And what is God using today in this room to draw other Muslims to faith in Christ? Our purpose there is not to judge, but to listen and to faithfully record what God is doing as told by the people in whose hearts God is working.